I'm Jonathan Snipes from Fallsington Friends Meeting, and this is the third in a series of what we call Quakerism in a nutshell, or Introduction to Quakerism. Many of you are probably friends very familiar with Quaker thought and practice, and one of the areas we thought we would look at is Quaker history from a spiritual perspective. So we're really very grateful and thrilled to have all of you join us this morning. I think we'll go ahead and start. And the Fallsington Friends Meeting, Fallsington Quaker Meeting Worship and Ministry Committee has invited Doug Miller of Pennsbury Manor to come and share with us. Many of you may have met Doug before or been to Pennsbury Manor, which is probably the premier historical site in Pennsylvania. And Doug has over 30 years of experience at historic sites in Pennsylvania and actually directing a number of different sites, including Pennsbury Manor, Hope Lodge, Graham Park, Washington Crossing, and others. And if you've met Doug, you know that he is just really a fountain of information about Pennsylvania, colonial Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania history, and history of William Penn. And I'm going to go out there and say, Doug, you're the foremost authority on William Penn in the world. That's what I'm guessing. No one else has spent so much time thinking about Penn and his legacy for us today. And I guess the Worship Ministry Committee kind of challenged Doug a little bit to speak on something he doesn't normally, as he shared with me, get a request to do, which is the spiritual life of William Penn, the spiritual journey of Penn. Penn is also often thought of as a political leader, colonial leader, but maybe we don't know as much about what his spiritual journey was all about. So we shared some queries with Doug to get us started. So Doug is going to speak with us about Penn's early spiritual journey. Then we'll have a time for questions from you all. And then he will speak a bit more on the impact of Penn's spiritual and religious ideas on the founding of Pennsylvania and some of the legacies we live with today from that time. So being really super grateful for you, Doug, and for your time and for all the friends that have gathered this morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that the weather got in the way. I was looking forward to seeing everyone face to face in the meeting house. And I shared with some of the early attendees this morning. One of my contributors this morning is, and I'm very biased here, my favorite Quaker, who happens to be my 20-year-old daughter, who made a life conversion and is a member of the Horsham Friends Meeting. So she shared some information with me as well. Jonathan, modestly, I have to admit, I think probably the living scholar on William Penn is his most recent biographer, Andy Murphy, who was a Bucks County boy, taught at Rutgers, and was stolen away by UVA and is teaching down there. But if anyone's interested in the political Penn, he wrote a book, and hands down the most thorough biography that I've ever come across is his most recent book. It's called William Penn, A Life. So for those of you that want to follow along with Penn's life, that was the source that I turned to most. For those that want Penn light, I still recommend a book called Architect of a Nation by John B. Trussell. And that's a lighter read. It is a much more dated biography, but it covers a lot about his life and his legacy. And as Jonathan said, he approached me about Penn's spiritual journey. And I've frequently fallen into the pitfall, as many historians do, about the political Penn and the colony builder Penn, rather than following his spiritual journey. And I think, interestingly, the two are so intertwined that they're really not. It's a life, as Andy Murphy says, a single life of a single man. And his faith guided him through many decisions, many hardships, many ups and downs. And it was a circuitous path in many ways. Penn's father carries his name, William Penn. And Penn's grandfather helped get his son William Penn Sr., or William Penn's father, a commission in the Royal Navy. And as a captain in the Royal Navy, this was in the early phases of the English Civil War, which is actually more than one war kind of all strung together. And the opposition was bringing arms, munitions, men, supplies into the coast. So they had the Royal Navy patrolling the coast, and Admiral Penn distinguishes himself. He interrupts the flow of arms and so on. So he becomes a rising star. And about this time, he catches the eye of this beautiful woman, Margaret Jasper and Vanderhaar. She is a Dutch expatriate, and they will be married in 1643, and in 1644, their son is born. That would be R. William Penn. He's baptized within pretty much 1 week of his birth at All Hallows. So even as a child, he is exposed to a religious upbringing. Admiral Penn was a member of the Church of England. At various points in English history, you had to be a member of the Church of England in order to hold either political office or as a citizen. At different points in English history, you would have to pay a tithe to worship other than the Church of England. Of course, there are multiple wars across Europe and in England between Protestant and Catholic, as well as in Ireland between Protestant and Catholic. And these are kind of the undercurrents as Penn is being raised. Well, Admiral Penn was granted his admiralty. He is a rising star in the Royal Navy. And unlike his father, who was a low-level diplomat to Morocco and a mercantile owner in London, Admiral Penn has amassed quite a fortune. The fortunate thing for a warrior at that point, if you were in the admiral's chair, when you take enemy shipping, 1/3 of the take goes to the crown or to the king, 1/3 of the take gets divvied up by the crew, and 1/3 of the take goes into the admiral's coffers. And Admiral Penn wanted the best for his son, William, his firstborn. So Admiral Penn sends young William off to Chigwell School, simultaneously to the admiral being engaged in one of 5 different Anglo-Dutch wars that will happen in the 17th century. So in 1652 into 1653, the admiral's at war against the Dutch. In 1656, the admiral will move his family to Ireland, to Macroom Castle. Now, part of Oliver Cromwell, who has won the English Civil War, his plan was to anglicize Ireland. How he was doing this was he was taking Irish estates and giving them to English politicians, and in particular, military officers who could suppress and subjugate the Irish. So the Penns are not necessarily revered in Ireland. While at Castle Macroom, the beginning of Penn's journey into Quakerism starts, because there is this very charismatic Quaker orator named Thomas Lowe, who was invited to speak by the admiral at Castle Macroom. And young Penn is smitten by this guy. He continues his time at Chigwell, and Chigwell at that time, while it is one complex, it was actually 2 schools, one in English, one in Latin. You were studying the classics, but it was also strongly religiously based. The previous headmaster was criticized and basically accused of popery at the time. And while these religious undercurrents truly weren't undercurrents, they were a groundswell or a wave that would go back and forth like the tide across England. Well, young Penn, Chigwell historian, basically talks about him as being very sensitive, with a rich and active spiritual life. Penn himself later will say, while at Chigwell, that Christ had visited my soul in my younger years. The story persists that Penn was at age 11 at Chigwell, and in his words, he said he was suddenly surprised with an inward comfort and an external glory. And later, Penn talks about the times that the inner light shone most brightly with him, and he uses the term spiritual ravishings for his being so consumed with God's presence that he can't deny it. Well, by 1660, Penn had graduated from Chigwell or moved on from Chigwell, and his father, having again tremendous resources. By this point, Admiral Penn had rose to the third highest position in the Royal Navy. And we get glimpses of the Penn family life through Admiral Penn's next door neighbor, Samuel Pepys, who is a diarist. He's also a subordinate of Admiral Penn, and he doesn't like Admiral Penn very much. So he's highly critical of that. And of course, any type of family intrigues, Samuel Pepys is more than happy to put pen to paper and criticize the admiral about. But Penn, young William, will talk about his time at Oxford as his persecution. And Andrew Murphy says it was a deeply unhappy time for Penn. There is a tax to be enrolled there. And basically, Oxford at that time is grooming people in the ways of the Church of England, and in particular, the sons of wealthy, politically connected, and military leaders to basically raise the next generation to go into politics in England. During that time, you had to wear certain clothing. You had to attend vespers at a certain time. You had to pray certain prayers as mandated by the institution. Young Penn didn't like this, and he railed against it. Penn will refer to it as a place of hell darkness and debauchery. I always liked that quote, and I kind of figured Oxford is not using that on their t-shirts. However, I think that gives us a glimpse at how out of step Penn is with what's going on. And I would suggest that those two early life experiences, the one when he's at Macroom with his family and meets Thomas Lowe and hears that, and then being introduced to the inner light himself at Chigwell. And he says between age 11 and age 15 that he experiences a number of these ravishings where he feels close to God and that God has come to him directly. So ultimately, Penn leaves Oxford after 2 years. And there are conflicting biographical accounts. William Penn claims he has written a book while at Oxford that is offensive to the faculty, and they basically eject him. There is no record at Oxford confirming this. What we do know for sure is that after 2 unhappy years at Oxford, Penn is taken out, and the admiral looks for, okay, where else can my son get his education? And the admiral is very much grooming his son to go into this military household, this military tradition. So young William is sent to Europe. He will ultimately end up in Saumur, France. and it is a Huguenot academy. There is a very famous Huguenot who is the headmaster of the academy. Many biographers want, Penn's choice being to go there to study under this man. The truth is that man is deathly ill at the time that Penn arrives, and their interactions were probably limited. Within 6 months, he passes. But one of the things that I always like to point out about 17th century Huguenots in France is they're being oppressed by the French government. And they are huge proponents of religious toleration. And I would suggest that some of those seeds of religious toleration that we will see later in Penn are planted while there. Penn also has a disturbing experience. He's actually in London. He is still the son of aristocracy because the admiral has been knighted. He's a fop. He's wearing the best clothing, and actually gets into an altercation with a Frenchman in Paris. The Frenchman demands to have satisfaction, and the two of them have a duel with swords. Young Penn disarms his opponent, and a experienced swordsman and somebody being raised in a military tradition is taught how to use weapons from an early age. He disarms his opponent without striking a blow, returns the sword to him, and sends him on his way. But he'll later write about how crazy it is that over a social slight that they come to near fatal blows. And it really disturbs young Penn. And I would say that even though it's an act of violence and that it has a spiritual effect on him because it really freaked him out. Penn, while in Europe, he gets to travel, attends many different churches, services, but he comes back. There is an Anglo-Dutch War, one of the multiple ones. We heard about the one in the 1650s. It's the 1660s. The admiral has helped restore the son of the guy that lost the English Civil War to the throne. Charles I lost, Charles II ascends the throne, in part with the admiral's help. And the Penn's admiral still owns this estate in Ireland, Castle Macroom. And William is back in Ireland. He's in Cork. He is still Church of England. He has basically been dispatched by his father to Ireland with British forces to subdue an uprising. And young Penn will see battle action at a place called Carrickfergus. It's after that he's at a clothier in Cork, and the clothier happens to be a Quaker. And Penn is speaking about this guy that had influenced him and just he thought was the bee's knees, named Thomas Lowe. And this shop owner says, Thomas Lowe is speaking within 100 miles of here. Well, when you're the rich guy's son, you have the best horses, the best carriages, and so on. And young William sets out to see Thomas Lowe again. And he listens to his oration, and it is the tipping point for young Penn to make his life conversion to Quakerism. I would suggest that having experienced war and seen it firsthand on the battlefield, having traveled broadly, and most important, spiritually, understanding or having his own understanding that God did come to him directly. God didn't go through a pastor, he didn't go through a priest, and he was right there. So the precepts that Thomas Lowe is discussing as the Quaker faith is emerging, of peace, of the inner light, of spiritual equality, they resonate in a way that none of the other religious services, none of the other religious doctrine that he's been exposed to has so far. So he makes a conscious decision to make this life conversion. it breaks his father's heart. They will have a rocky relationship from this point forward. His father, of course, this was his firstborn son. This is the man that he's grooming to take on English politics, to take on a military title and mantle, and to move the next generation of Penns even further than the Admiral has. The Admiral canes him. He actually throws him out of the house. Now, the biographers are all over the board about this story. There is no question that the Admiral picks up a cane and beats his son. There is no question that he throws him out. But there is one account that basically has, within the same day, a servant going to recover young Penn and his goods and bring him back home. Others have him wandering the streets, homeless, etc., which I think is a huge exaggeration. But I think one of the things that stands out to me about Penn's spiritual journey, and up to this instant, there is a very deep love and affection between father and son. And to stand his ground with probably the most influential man in his life. I know that personally, my relationship with my late father is one of the high points of my life. And I have to believe William Penn felt the same way about his father. But that the inner light, his spiritual compass, points him, even though he knows it's going to disappoint his father, even though he's going against his father's wishes. And his father essentially, fiscally at this point, disowns him. He says, "You're not going to get anything. You are on your own, kid." But Penn persists. Penn will, through other Quaker orators, come into the presence of the founder of the faith, George Fox, a apprentice cobbler who at a certain point has the inner light open to himself and recognizes there's a different way. Penn will soon be an active pamphleteer. He will go on, if you will, a mission trip to Europe. I'll probably butcher the guy's name, but it's 1671, and he makes a trip to Germany. There is a French spiritual leader and mystic, de la Body, who has many of the same precepts of God being able to directly contact you, of solitary reflection. And Penn is enamored with this guy and decides, I want to go and talk to him. And one of the things that I was asked in planning the thing is, what are some of Penn's disappointments? This guy totally blows William Penn off, and he's hugely disappointed after meeting the guy and so on. And he writes about it. And I think that those of us that revere Penn frequently say, well, how could you not like him? There were lots of people who didn't like him. And I think these two just were oil and water. You know, along his spiritual journey, one of his disappointments, of course, was the fact that his father just could not reconcile himself that young William would break from the Church of England that had baptized him, who would throw out a promising political career because you needed to be Church of England to be in Parliament, and really break with the family. And while it's a familial disappointment, it's wrapped up in his spiritual journey. And when Fox comes to the colonies to speak out against this English institution of slavery, and he will visit the Caribbean and he will visit West Jersey to talk about this issue. And in the second part of our talk, I'll talk a little bit more about the issue of slavery. Penn is pretty much left as the leader of Quakers in England. By the mid 1670s, Penn has become aware he's lost his beloved father. His father actually did not remove him from the will. And Penn has inherited this fabulous fortune. He's also married well. His beloved Guliama, his life mate, is a fellow Quaker, but also comes from a very well off Quaker family. They have started their family. They have lost 3 children early, twins and a son, or a daughter, I'm sorry. And, he's had disappointments in those losses. But he is actually asked by 2 fellow Quakers to help them settle a dispute over their financial investments in this Quaker enclave of West Jersey. He finds that one of the proprietary interests is available and he buys in. There's a first swell of Quakers, about 120 of them come in the mid 1670s. The following year, about 230. And by the time Penn delves into this idea of a new colony, there are hundreds of Quakers populating West Jersey. Penn will get into a pamphleting back and forth with a Protestant minister who is viciously anti-Quaker. And his Sandy Foundation Shaken is a response in pamphlet form to the criticism that this Presbyterian minister, Thomas Vincent, is throwing towards the Quakers at the time. As Penn is sitting down, and I think a significant part of his spiritual journey is he's sitting down, contemplating his words, putting pen to paper, and because he had the best education that money could buy at that time, he's an accomplished author. I find it kind of ironic. Penn, in Some Fruits of Solitude, will say, have few books and choose them wisely. But here's a guy that's cranking out books all the time. And he will write about the liberty of conscience. And I love this quote: the plain English of liberty, of conscience, this, namely, free and uninterrupted exercise of our conscience and a way of worship, we are most clearly persuaded God requests us to serve him. And I think along his spiritual journey, that's one of my favorite Penn quotes. Now, by 1677, Penn and Fox will travel back to Germany. It's actually a better trip than the early one. And Penn will actually write excessively about the loss of Thomas Lowe and his dear friendship with this man who actually helped guide him into the faith. Moving forward, and it's going to be tied up in the colony building, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot more on the spiritual side because we brought him into Quakerism as a cornerstone in the faith, in the development of the faith. But he stands true to his Quaker faith throughout his life. He will, at a certain point, be accused of treason, and treason is one of 2 capital offenses. A core precept for a Quaker is the truth. James has advocated. His son-in-law, William, has started to raise armies to try to drive him out rather than face another civil war, which had beheaded James's father. James advocates. Penn is accused of treason because of his close relationship with James and is under a death sentence. And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says in court, James was my friend at his height. He'll be my friend at his desolation. And he will not renounce James. To him, to Penn, that was the truth. And Penn's religion and his spirituality is deeply in interwoven with all of his political works. So at this point, I see that the quote about Penn doing God's work, that comes directly from Liberty of Conscience. Because I love it, I don't mind repeating it at all. So Penn will write in Liberty of Conscience that plain English of liberty of conscience is this, namely, the free and uninterrupted exercise of our conscience. In that way that we worship, we are most clearly persuaded, and God requests of us to serve him. And there's more to the quote, but to me, that really catches it very well. And it's one of the quotes that I like a lot about the spiritual Penn. So at this point, Jonathan, I've taken us along a spiritual path. Do we want to take some Q&A or some other discussions? I'd love to have other people chime in with things that they think about when it comes to the spiritual Penn or their own journey.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for bringing us into Penn's early spiritual journey. There were things you said that I certainly had not heard before. But one thing struck me, and I'll just say this and then open it up for questions, is you said somewhere between ages 11 and 15, he was having, as he called it, these spiritual ravishings, these times when God is revealed to him personally. And that's an ongoing precept and for him, that personal revelation. But that struck me because I've heard other people say that too, that it's around actually the age of 11. I have a number of people who've said that that was a time of spiritual opening for them as, you know, as a child, but moving into adolescence. So that just struck me. But I wonder if other friends here have questions, if you just want to, or comments you want to make, if you just unmute yourselves and say what's on your heart.
Hi, my name is Nina. This is just to echo what Jonathan said, but I was raised Catholic, and you hear about a lot of the saints. And I'm forgetting one of that. I forget which one in particular. A woman uses those words, like in the 1500s, to talk about the ravishings that she had, and it was directly from God. So it's interesting to see this interplay of highly spiritual people.
Nina, I was raised Lutheran, and I always joke with people that a Lutheran is just a Catholic who can't remember all the saints. And one of the things that since you brought up Catholicism, Penn will write some anti-Catholic tracts. No Cross, No Crown is really looking at popery and so on. And I had the opportunity to work on a oral history project, and I'll always remember the professor's name because his name was Paul Newman, not the actor, but a professor. And Paul and I were talking about later, there is, during this time of William and Mary, a backlash against Catholicism, and Catholics are being oppressed in England. And there is this immigration of Catholics to Penn's colony. And by this point, Penn welcomes them with open arms. And he actually will write about and speak at Parliament about the idea of, you know, these people are worshiping the same God we are, and maybe we ought to be a little more lenient about that. And I love that because it's part of his spiritual journey, but it's also part of his maturation as a man, where at one point, these people are the enemy. And as he matures, as he's exposed to more of the faith, as he's exposed to more life experiences and so on, he's come to this determination that they should be allowed to worship as they choose as well. And you get this mini migration of Catholics to religiously tolerant Pennsylvania, even some out of Calvert, Maryland, to move up here. And just you're bringing up the Catholic faith kind of triggered that with me.
Are there other friends with a comment or question?
I Doug, this is Jonathan Sprout. I have a question. I I love I did a lot of research on William Penn, and I did not learn a lot of what you've said already. So thank you.
You're welcome.
But one of the things that really struck me was how many times he ended up in jail for various reasons. You're probably going to get into that because I think a lot of that had to do with his finances. But I love the quote where they came to him and they apparently said, you know, if you'll just renounce Quakerism or if you'll just say this, we'll let you out. We don't really want you in jail. It'll be a win-win. And I love how he said, I think it was, I owe my conscience to no mortal man. And I wonder if at some point in the day, if you could sort of elaborate on that.
Jonathan, I'm glad you brought it up. Not by design, but basically by timing, I hadn't wanted to go too deeply into Penn the jailbird because he will spend time in jail, ironically, in the same room at one point that his father was briefly jailed in the 1650s. And I always joked with my museum store manager that we should get a temporary tattoo, like a prison tattoo, for William Penn, because he was in jail quite often, always having to do with his religion and his conscience. And again, I spoke about how Penn was so dedicated to his religion. It was so a part of his core that he would risk and break the relationship with his beloved father. Well, he would risk prison frequently. And I think my favorite Penn writing is his prison tract when he's really not in prison. He's in kind of think of it as house arrest, but Some Fruits of Solitude from the 1690s. And it's his collection of life axioms. But Penn will repeatedly stand his ground, understanding that he is going to be jailed. And in reflecting about young Penn, the late teens, early 20s, I always figured if he was around in the 1960s, he would have been a member of SDS, Students for Democratic Society. He's railing against the man. But his drive, like many of those, was peace, but driven through this spiritual journey. I think most of us that have read a little bit about Penn know about the Penn Mead trial, sometimes called the Hat trial, and he will be jailed for trumped up charges, not following the rules. He is basically the heroes in that, and they will influence his governmental structuring, are the jury who find him not guilty, and the judge says, no, you're wrong, and he puts them under house arrest. And there is such an outcry from the English populace that the judge has to back up. And it's the first time in English law where the will of the jury supersedes the will of the judge. Penn, having experienced that, will reflect that in his governmental work. I think the most dangerous time when he is jailed is when he is under accusation of treason. And it's during this time that the colony is actually taken away from him and kept under crown rule. He will, shortly after coming out from that, lose his beloved Gulielma, and he'll lose his firstborn son. And just as he was groomed by his father, William was very much grooming Springett to be the heir, to carry on that next generation, both spiritually, economically, and politically. So, Jonathan, that's a very long answer to a short question. I apologize. Amy, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Doug. Echoing that, I came today because I really wanted to get to know William Penn better, and often found myself wondering like what his worship experience was like when he was a recorded member of Fallsington Friends Meeting or Falls Meeting in the 1600s. Kind of what you know about his experience worshiping with other friends in the area.
You know, one of the things that I've been interested to find is he moved around. And while he was worshiping at Falls, he would also go over to Burlington, worship there. Once Philadelphia was well established, he appears in meeting minutes in Philadelphia. So he was in many ways and I would argue it is as much the spiritual journey as the governor's journey because he is going not to political places, although you can make a strong argument. The early political structure of Pennsylvania was hugely Quaker dominated and influenced. And I think one of the favorite stories that we tell at Pennsbury all the time is the wedding of the Sautchers. And we really don't know whether it happened at Fallsington or it happened at Pennsbury. And I know there are Sautcher descendants in the audience here, but again, he carves out time and bears witness to this union of two people that are under his employment. There will be issues that come up in meeting minutes where we look at Pennsbury for interesting stories that we can tell. So we actually keep copies, and if you're ever interested, we have copies of the Falls meeting minutes at Pennsbury in our library, and they're a treasure trove of sometimes disputes among friends that are brought to meeting to settle, as well as discussions of births and deaths and things along those lines. And I think having Falls within an easy horse ride or carriage ride was a point for him of comfort. Of course, you've got people in Bristol, Burlington is well established, and Penn's a naval son. He had this barge that was the Cadillac Escalade of the day, and it was probably as easy to hop on the barge to go to Burlington as it was to traverse the rough roads over to Fallsington.
Doug, do you want to move to your next comments about Pennsylvania and the impact of Penn's faith on his founding of Pennsylvania?
I'd be happy to, Jonathan, and admittedly, among friends here, this is the part that I know probably better than the spiritual. I'm going to skip us back 3 generations very quickly in the Penn lineage, and I touched on some of this stuff earlier. Penn's grandfather is a guy named Giles Penn, and Giles is a merchant, but his mercantile business takes him to North Africa to buy wares to sell in his business. And on one of these trips, Barbary pirates had kidnapped 200 English citizens, and they're holding them for ransom. Giles is part of the group that negotiates their safe release. And for that, the King of England at that time, Charles I, awards Giles a diplomatic posting to Morocco. I bring the story up twofold. It starts the Penn family interacting with the crown, and it begins the Penn family in political positions. We talked about how the admiral rises up and becomes a hero for England. And in England, when we talk outside of Quaker circles about William Penn, the William Penn that they know is Admiral Sir William Penn. So the English Civil War has occurred. Oliver Cromwell, after winning it, names himself Lord Protector of England. I always thought that was a really cool title, by the way, and I'd love to be the Lord Protector of Pennsbury Manor. And England is draped in a very staunch Puritan robe for the rule of Oliver Cromwell. A portion of Cromwell's desire was that England was becoming too flashy under the Church of England, and he really wanted stauncher puritanical rule as well as political rule by Parliament rather than the crown. Well, Oliver Cromwell passes. The populace of England would like to have a king back. And before losing his head, Charles had actually had two sons who are hiding in plain sight in Brittany. Brittany, at this instant in history, is not part of France, it is part of England. And 11 prominent citizens are chosen to go to Brittany, sit down with the son, Charles II, and his kid brother, James, and tell them, honestly, if you come back to England, you can be king and we won't cut your head off. So on board the admiral's ship is his upstart son, young William. And the decision is reached to bring Charles II back, restore him to the throne. It is a bloodless restoration. And for every inch of austerity that you will see under Oliver Cromwell, Charles II is over the top opulent. One of my favorite guilty pleasures is on YouTube. There is a rap song called Charles II, the King of Bling. If you guys like YouTube, look it up. It'll crack you up. So Charles is restored to the throne. We lose the admiral. During the admiral's service, he had laid out cash out of pocket to keep English campaigns going, to pay for the commissary of over 2,000 troops under his command. The amount to keep a military campaign going at that point, when Parliament had cut off military spending, or as I like to say, the executive branch was not playing nice with the legislative branch. It was 11,000 pounds sterling, which is a fabulous amount of money. Well, the admiral never collects on it, and he passes. The debt now rests with Charles II and young William Penn. Young William, as we heard, has already invested in this West Jersey undertaking. He has written some of the founding legislation for the development of West Jersey, but basically all the proprietary interests, which there were 11 of them, they all can't get along with each other. And William Penn starts to get this idea that I could do better on my own. And he's looking at this model of Maryland, which is established under the rule of Charles I as an enclave for Catholicism. And I did a consultancy with the founding point of Maryland, St. Mary's City, about a decade ago. And they proudly told me how Maryland had religious toleration first, which they did until they rescinded it. And I pointed out it only counts if it lasts. However, Penn gets this idea of a family-owned colony, and he knew that the land west of the Delaware was under the auspice of New York. There is a naval battle that the admiral participates in called Lowencroft. It's an Anglo-Dutch war. On board the admiral's ship is the head of the Royal Navy. And after this sweeping victory, the admiral takes 2 steps back and he said, it's all about the head of the Royal Navy. He was whispering in my ear what to do. The head of the Royal Navy is James, who is the kid brother of the king. The admiral is a very wise politician. When there are accusations of fiscal mismanagement of the campaign and so on, the admiral says that was me. He doesn't let James take that arrow. So the crown knows that Admiral Penn has been protecting them. And at this point, the groundswell of Quakerism is causing unrest. And as our audience here are Quakers, I'm sure you know where the name comes from. They were not quiet at that time. They were interrupting ongoing services, and in the eyes of their detractors, they were a pain in the patootie. So William approaches in 1680 Charles II, and he says, hey, I got this idea I would like, in lieu of a payout on that debt to my father, what do you think about giving me some land in the New World to eradicate that debt? Well, the king says, I got to check with my kid brother, because after that victory over the Dutch, England takes over the Dutch territorial holdings. New Amsterdam gets rebranded as New York because James is the Duke of York. And New York extends from where we would understand it the whole way down to Maryland. James agrees with a caveat. He says, I kind of like this Newcastle idea, so give me a 12-mile circumference around Newcastle and we'll call it square. Have you ever looked at the map of Pennsylvania and seen that semicircular part down in the corner? That was James's request. So Penn is given the go-ahead. Charles II asks William Penn, what will you call your colony? And Penn proudly stands up and says, New Wales. Charles II had an advisor from Wales who absolutely hated the Penn family. And the advisor tells the king, don't do it. It's a bad idea. So Charles comes back to William and he says, listen, I'm not hot on the New Wales thing. Give me an alternative. Penn suggests Sylvania, or woodlands in Latin. Charles says, I like it, but you know, the debt of my family to your family is to your father. England owes a debt, and my family, the crown, owes a debt to your father that we'll never be able to repay. So we're going to name this new colony Pennsylvania in his honor. And young William, the Quaker, hates it. And he sits down, it's March 5th, 1681, and he writes a letter to his best friend, Robert Turner. And in that letter, there are a couple of pieces that historians have pulled out. The piece that I always like to talk about is Penn says, everyone's going to think it's a vanity on my part. And whenever I tell people that story, most of them think Pennsylvania's named for the Quaker guy, not the English war hero. Penn also uses the term holy experiment and seed of a nation. And these are items that historians have plucked out and wrapped themselves in writing about Penn. I find it interesting because he's not just thinking it as a colony, but as a religious undertaking, a holy experiment. And his experiment is to try to bring people of different religions together geographically. I would argue not integrated the way we would think of integrated schools and so on. You have the Swedes in Swedesboro, you have the Germans in Germantown, you have the Welsh track as he's developing it and so on. But he is voraciously, once he's granted the charter, pamphleting across Europe in different languages for the religiously disassociated to come and start a new life in Pennsylvania. And tongue-in-cheek, guys, it's all the whack jobs of Europe. My ancestors were Swiss Mennonites. We were very high on the whack job scale. However, my ancestors found a piece in Pennsylvania and a piece of Pennsylvania where they could worship as they chose and would not be oppressed coming here. Pennsylvania was not the cheapest land. Penn was a developer. And I have always challenged people who always look at him through the political lens or through the religious lens to also think about that. His business model is to buy the land from the Native Americans fairly, sell it at a markup to the influx of first settlers, whatever their religion might be, but then to establish quit rent, which is a medieval term, way oversimplifying it. You owe taxes and homage to the feudal landholder. So Penn knows that there are hundreds of Quakers in West Jersey at this point. He selects as his lieutenant governor his cousin, Captain William Markham. He arms Markham with 5 letters of introduction to roughly, we estimate, 800 to 1,200 people who are living in areas that will ultimately fall under Penn's governorship. One of those letters is to the King of the Canadas. And for everyone in Fallsington, in Morrisville, there is a rock outcrop called the Greystones. And there's a small monument to it that was put up 100 years ago. This is the point where the first purchase of land under Penn's rule occurs. And Captain Markham, through trade goods, negotiates with the Lenape leadership that are there, buys the land pretty much from that point going west to Playwicky Farm, or it was a Native American village, inland 12 to 15 miles, south down to the Yosemite Creek into the Delaware. I, of course, want it to be William Penn spiritually seeing the Lenape as equals and wanting to deal fairly with them. I will also say the King of England is strongly encouraging not just Penn, but all colonial governors to deal fairly with the natives. In the 10 to 15 years prior to William Penn getting the charter, there's a war down around Jamestown, an Anglo-Powhatan war. There is a war, the Powhatans being Native Americans, so colonial and native war. In central Pennsylvania, 1674, 1675, the Fur Trade War between the Iroquois and the Susquehannock, but being fueled by the Calverts of Maryland and the Dutch and English traders in what we now know as New York. And the worst, King Philip's War up at the Plymouth colony, King Philip being the son of Massasoit, the propagator of the legendary First Thanksgiving. It's a war that snowballs. By the end of it, 1/3 of the colonial population of New England will die. 50% of the native population of New England will perish. And wars are very expensive to the crown. So I think Penn's spiritual compass would not have him using force of arms to take land. His desire for truth and for fair play will have him working with the natives to fairly buy the land. I gave a similar chat during a school tour, and there was a Swarthmore professor who was a chaperone on that event, and she took exception to me saying that Penn had dealt fairly with native peoples. And I explained to her the purchase, and she said, well, it was just, trinkets and trade goods. I said, there's an inventory, and it was essentially 2,100 pounds sterling of trade goods. The whole debt that all of Pennsylvania is founded on is 16,000 pounds. To me, it sounds like a pretty square deal. And then she, of course, brought up that Native Americans did not understand European land ownership. The Dutch established a trading post between Morrisville and Trenton in the 1620s. We are 3 generations of natives into Europeans being in the Delaware drainage. They fully understood European land ownership. And they wanted to cooperate with Penn for a number of reasons, not the least of which is they were in great decline because of European diseases, and they needed allies. They had also established themselves as middlemen to carry trade goods further inland and trade for the furs that was the cash crop that people were looking for. So Penn establishes this good relationship with the Lenape. He arrives here in 1682, having written what's called the Great Law. The Great Law is how people are supposed to get along with him and with government. His first frame of government will be in place from that point until almost 20 years later. Penn will go through a series of difficulties. He has to leave his fledgling Pennsylvania. Now his family, his beloved Guliama and his children are back in England as he's building this colony. He's attending meeting at Burlington at that time. He is very active in discussions of the faith. He attends yearly meeting, which at that time is in Burlington. But he's also doing this entrepreneurial thing, and he has to play court games. Fairly quickly, a dispute happens with his neighbors to the south. His advance man goes down, tries to negotiate with the Calverts, and the hereditary title of the leader is the Lord Baltimore. Those two don't hit it off. When Penn arrives, he's like, I'll go down, I'll straighten everything out. Penn arrives, and the northern edge of the Calvert claim is supposedly at the 40th parallel. And Penn, being a navigator and so on, proudly tells the Lord Baltimore that the 40th parallel runs pretty much through modern day Baltimore. The Lord Baltimore chooses to disagree, and those two will have a hate-hate relationship for the rest of their lives. Being students of truth, the 40th parallel is about where the Pennsylvania Turnpike is. And those families will continue to fight over that boundary for 3 generations until the king at the time in the 1750s is so fed up with both families, the Calverts and the Penns, that he writes to them and he said, I've hired 2 surveyors. One's named Mason and one's named Dixon. I'm sending them over and you people will shut up and live with it. Thus, we get the division between those colonies and now the states.
Mason-Dixon.
Mason-Dixon line. They were Englishmen and they were surveyors that were sent over by the crown to finally settle that dispute that starts when Penn arrives. However, if we are those new colonists that move in, if you want a great tax dodge, all you have to do is say to these governors, I'm not sure whose colony I'm living in, so we'll settle up on the taxes after you guys settle it. Penn, being a good Quaker, being an honest citizen, felt that people would do the right thing. I think many American citizens, if they could dodge their taxes, they would. And in the 17th century, Penn's business model is an abysmal failure. His political model is struggling as well. It is 1699. Penn has lost his beloved Gooley. He's been accused of treason, been under house arrest, lost the colony, had the colony reinstated. And the governor that he has appointed here is giving far too many concessions to the populace, concessions that go against the crown rule. Penn has to straighten this mess out. He talks to his family. It's decided that I won't say new bride because they've been married a number of years at this point, but his bride, Hannah Callahill Penn, his daughter from the first marriage, Letitia, and he will travel to Pennsylvania, and he's going to straighten out this mess. So they arrive here in November of 1699. Hannah is extremely pregnant for the sea voyage, which must have been horrendous for her. She is a fellow Quaker. She is the daughter of one of Penn's first purchasers, a fabulously wealthy linen merchant named Thomas Callahill. In a house in Upland that they're staying, the firstborn son of this second union, John, who will pick up the nickname John the American, is born. Penn sits with legislature, basically tells them, guys, this politics thing, I got the rule right the first time. And everyone basically says, no, Bill, you didn't. And somewhat grudgingly, he revisits in 1700 and into 1701 this structure of government. His first structure had the governor being the chief executive, calling together legislature when it's time for a law, and the laws would flow down from the governor out to legislature and out to the populace. In this recast, and again, it wasn't easy for him. He will set up the governor as a chief executive. There will be a 2-part system in legislature. You can think House of Lords or House of Commons, or you can think Senate and House today. They are elected officials. And very important, the common man now has the right to vote, not just the landholders. He sets up his judiciary system where the rights of juries supersede the will of the judge, and that we have the right to trials. There are a number of precepts in his Charter of Privileges, 1701, that are reflected in our constitutional government. And I would argue, and many historians and political historians argue, that when it was time for a constitution, one of the models that was influential was Penn's Charter of Privileges, which by this time has picked up the nickname the Charter of Liberties. It's so popular by the 1750s, by the 50th anniversary of it, that the legislature, again, Quaker dominated by the mid 17th century, determines that they want to celebrate it, and they have a bell cast in its honor. It hangs in the State House, or did, and it's famous because it's got a crack in it, but nobody ever seems to remember that it was cast because of Penn's governance. Well, Penn has to rush home. His creditor, who has been a part of his life since those early days with Thomas Lowe and George Fox, a guy named Philip Ford, is calling in the chit for a loan of 5,000 pounds sterling. To hear Ford's side of it, I loaned this guy good money. He put up his capital, the colony of Pennsylvania, and he's reneging on the deal. Penn's side is, I trusted Ford and he's been embezzling from me for years. He put in front of me this document as collateral for, and had me sign it without me fully understanding that it was because Ford was the Radar O'Reilly who's putting stuff in front of Henry Blake. Sign this, according to Penn's side of the story. Ford will die before it is settled. Penn will have to pay to Ford's wife, and Penn will ultimately end up in debtor's prison. And it is only through wealthy fellow Quakers buying out his debt and buying him out of prison that he is released. By 1710, he is in desperate financial shape. He is woefully disappointed that his vision for this holy experiment, this colony, has failed in his mind. He's deeply in debt. He has sunk his personal wealth and, I would say, his intellectual juice into trying to make this thing work. And he's looking at a new family. He now has 3 sons that have survived from the second marriage. There's a son that survived from the first marriage, a daughter who survived from the first marriage, and he needs to straighten out his house. So he approaches Queen Anne. I'd like to sell Pennsylvania to you. And the purchase price would be the original debt owed to my father, 16,000 pounds sterling. Anne turns him down. I've already got a couple colonies. What do I need another one for? And he's desperate. It's 1711. Hannah has lost her beloved father, Thomas Callowhill. Hannah was one of 9 children. She's the only one that survives to adulthood. Thomas had instilled in his daughter all of the business sense and financial ability that had made him a success. And I think that union between William and Hannah was kind of a power couple of the 17th century. He's the big picture guy, but she is the person that can straighten out the details. By this point, the negotiations have moved forward with Anne. William has dropped the purchase price, Queen Anne, the purchase price to 11,000 pounds sterling, and Anne has accepted. The documents are being drawn up, but the son from the first marriage contests it. Thomas Callowhill passes. Hannah is chosen to be the executrix. To me, this is very telling because normally it would be the son-in-law, the male of the family. I think Thomas Callowhill knew, don't trust William with the purse strings. He's a visionary when it comes to the spiritual and the political, but when it comes to the financial, he's out of his element. And as they are going back to their home, Penn is seized by stroke. He is debilitated, but recovering somewhat. And his doctors ask Hannah to keep government and politics off of his plate. Don't burden him. He's struggling. Hannah Penn steps up, and for the next 15 years, in function, but never in title. She is the governor in absentia of Pennsylvania. She is calling the major shots because Pennsylvania belongs to the Penn family. It is a proprietary colony. Young Billy, William Penn III, will continue to contest the will and will back out of the deal because it's such muddy and ugly family waters that she doesn't want to get sucked into. So at this point, Hannah's left with this failing financial millstone of Pennsylvania, a dead father, and an infirmed husband. She will begin to straighten out the financial mess that is Pennsylvania, working with Penn's secretary, James Logan, who came here as a teenager in 1699 with the Penns, but stayed and becomes their land agent here. Young Billy will die before it is settled. The courts will, for his heirs, try to represent his side, but ultimately in 1726, just 3 months before Hannah's death, the courts will decide that Pennsylvania will pass to Hannah and the 3 sons of the second marriage, John, Richard, and Thomas, and they will have equal parts in the governance of Pennsylvania. What guided him in his government was very much his spirituality. He looked at it as a holy experiment. He wanted it to be a Garden of Eden for those who worshiped God. He recognized that different people worship God differently. When he wrote to the King of the Canadas in that first letter, he singles out the fact that they are worshiping the same God, that there is one God. Native Americans still refer to God as creator. And to wrap up on kind of that colony builder part of Penn's life and so on, and to tie in a couple pieces, I wanted to touch on Native peoples that I just brought up. Penn attends yearly meeting during his final visit here. And recently, one of my subordinates, a young lady who's a tour guide at the front desk, was reading the meeting minutes, and she came to me very excited. And I want to give Kelly White a shout out because Kelly had found where in the meeting minutes it says the governor's attending, and he proposes bringing natives to meeting. Penn sees them as spiritually equal and wants them to experience the inner light of Quakerism the same way that he had. But even more telling, in that same meeting, he proposes a separate meeting for Negroes. Individual meetings had brought in some Negroes, but it's not until the Free Quaker Meeting takes them in as equal members of meeting, almost 75 years after Penn brings this up. And to me, just those little lines are very telling because he's looking for the spiritual in everyone. And he's trying his best to accommodate that spirituality, both in a physical place as well as in a freedom of conscience for them to pursue the inner light and pursue God as they choose to. I kind of want to wrap up with a quote from Faith and Practice. And this is where the shout out goes to my daughter, Jillian, for sharing her volume with me and finding it. True godliness doesn't turn men out of the world, but enables them to better live in it and excites their endeavor to mend it. Not hide their candle under a bushel, but set it upon a table and in a candlestick. So at this point, I'd be happy to hear some of your experiences and try to answer any questions you might have. Amy, I saw your hand. Yeah.
Friends, I'm feeling really strongly Spirit asking that we create a container for what we just learned about William Penn's statements
about people of color. Not as a part of a wonderful, litany of facts and information, but as something that is alive today. I'm feeling that perhaps we could hold some space for worship around that in some way.
Amy, I want to chime in a little bit because Jonathan had asked me, and just for time purposes, I didn't get it to it. I do want to be clear. Penn was an enslaver himself. He owned slaves. And Fox, obviously a huge influence in his life. By the 1660s, George Fox looks around him in England and he's like, this institution is really messed up and I need to take action. And we, as good Quakers, need to take action. So he begins to first speak among Quakers who are in slaveholders. And I use the term enslaver because I don't want to whitewash this part of Penn's life. Penn, I am unsure of the slaves that his father would have owned, but I feel fairly confident by his place in society, he would have owned slaves. Penn arranges for slaves to be bought off the first slave ship that comes to Philadelphia in 1684. It is a subordinate who makes those choices. Some of them, he follows Fox's teachings, and Fox is proposing to those early Quakers and early English citizens because he is spreading a wider net. He's trying to instruct good Englishmen, not just good Quakers, that the institution of slavery is wrong. So we, if we were 17th century Englishmen, should treat them more like an indenture. Obviously, we have a financial commitment to this person's services to us, just like an indenture. We should retain them while we get that payoff. We should care for them, but we should free them at the end, like an indenture, and have armed them. And Fox was arming them spiritually as well as, physically. And when I say armed, I mean financially, warm clothing, a place to go, things like that. Obviously not arms. And Penn, I think, struggles with this. There is an enslaved man who is willed to William Penn by one of the wealthiest Quakers in West Jersey. His last name is Morris, and Morris was an enslaver. He owned 66 slaves. He ran an ironworks. And when he dies, 60 of those men and women are sold as cattle. 6 are given to individuals. 1 is referred to in the familiar. One of the shining parts, I think, of Penn's legacy, and hopefully I can circle us back to that, was his relationship with the Lenape. And Penn was a linguist. There is a early 20th century biographer that took a letter that he had written to the Society of Free Traders, which is like 8 pages long, writing about the Lenape, but wrote a whole book about Penn and the Delaware Indians. But there is some truth to that. And I found myself in Oklahoma with the descendant community of the Lenape, the Delaware tribe of Indians. And I was there with my educator, and we were going to give a presentation, and we were in the lunch line. And one of the tribal members stopped me and he said, you were the first guy to tell me that he had nothing to do with the walking purchase. I always thought he was a villain, and now I'm finding out that that's not so. And most recently, and I'm sure as good friends, you all saw the misstep of the National Park Service wanting to remove the William Penn statue from Welcome Park and the William Penn timeline. And one of the people that I'm closest to in the Delaware Tribe of Indians is their educator. And he's been quoted in the news basically saying, and for the descendants of the Lenape, the walking purchase is a serious point of trauma for them. And it will be a catalyst that will start 8 forced removals that will land them. And we're talking a group that when they left here were thousands by the time they end up at the different points where they will end up, 2 in Ontario, 1 in Stockbridge, Wisconsin, 2 in Oklahoma, there will be 250 descendants left. Their numbers have swelled to over 15,000 at this point, but they still see Penn as one of the people who could be trusted, who was a man of integrity, who looked out for them. When selling land to first purchasers, you had to agree to allow the Lenape to cross over your land to be able to hunt and fish in traditional areas that they had been. They were not to molest your livestock. They were not to go into your gardens and so on, but that was in the deed. And within a couple years, some of these first purchasers are kind of railing about that. And there are correspondence from Penn. He's incredulous going back after them saying, this was the deal. You know, this is what you agreed to. These people were here and they live here, and this is how they live. So there are certainly times of him being sort of the antithesis of that colonization. The part related to enslavement, there are times where he's a shining example. The man that I was talking about is actually, Penn follows exactly Fox's teachings. He gives Yaff his freedom. Yaff has traveled back from the colonies to England. And obviously, this man, Yaff, is somebody who is substantial, not just to Penn, but to the man who willed him to Penn, because he stands out among his peers. But Yaff chooses to return to the colonies. And I would love to know the rest of his story. There is a Yaff who appears at the Trent House later on. But Yaff is a free man. And of all the places he chooses, he comes back here. Is this home? Is this where family is? Is this where church is? I don't know that. But there is an example of Penn following Fox's teachings. There are other examples that leave us wanting. I'm happy to take other questions or to hear more from you guys about your experiences.
I don't know that much about Hannah Penn, and I was really interested to learn that for 15 years she was running the show in Pennsylvania. So I'm kind of curious to know what Hannah did to nurture the Quaker faith in our area.
So Hannah is supporting from England. She never returns to the colony. So as far as, you know, having a physical presence here, I'd be making stuff up if I put her here. She is working diligently, first off, because the colony is going to collapse if the economy collapses, to start to straighten out the mess that is the finances of Pennsylvania and of the Penn family. She remains a lifelong Quaker. Again, she came into the faith through the Bristol meeting, Bristol, England. Bristol has a sad history as a port that supported the slave trade, but she is somebody who is in touch with the leaders of England as a representative of a colonial proprietary family. Again, she's never given that grace of the title. Former First Lady Susan Corbett was the one who really challenged me to dig deeper into Hannah Penn. There is sorely lacking a good biography of her. We have a master's thesis that is an awesome piece, but it's not published and it's not circulated. And one of the things that Pennsbury is looking to do in 2026, for those of you that are students of history, some of you I see share my hairstyle. We're children of the bicentennial, and we saw that fervor for history. And one of the things that Pennsbury plans on highlighting for 2026 is friend Hannah. It is the 300th anniversary of her passing. We did something similar for the 300th anniversary of the passing of friend William. And the staff in brainstorming decided we didn't want to do the Year of the Dead guy. So to Jonathan's point, we looked at legacy. And legacy can be good and it can be bad. And to understand some of the, many of the difficulties we have today, you need to have an eye on what happened historically to bring us to that racial unrest, the repeated trauma that Native peoples have had because of colonial expansionism. You know, Pennsylvania would not have turned out as it did without the Lenape. And a quick Hannah story. It's somewhat spiritual. It's not necessarily Quaker, but it ties to the Lenape. Hannah has lost her beloved William, and she writes to James Logan. Logan lets the local Lenape know, and they send her a fur robe edged with feathers to comfort her in her mourning. Well, I've been in touch with Delaware tribal members, and they say it's actually the other way around. The feathers are on the outside when we do one of these things because feathers shed water, and the fur lining is on the inside. But that was recorded at the time, and there is this reverence with the Native community for the Penn family, for William, and for Hannah. And they actually, at Pennsbury, prior to their leaving, they had borne witness to the Saucher wedding, but it was known that the Penns were going to have to go back and straighten out that financial mess with Penn's creditor. 200 sachems and their entourages arrive at Pennsbury for a 3-day blowout party that is recorded at the time as a powwow. And I always thought that was a 20th or 21st century term. No, it's a term that goes back. And there's 3 days of feasting. Penn reputedly gets into foot races with some of the Delaware and wins. Considering that during that stay he had suffered from gout, I think they probably threw the races. But there's obvious this affection between the Lenape and Penn. And the Lenape are recognized among Native peoples as the grandfather tribe or an ancient tribe, one of the earliest tribes out there. And my closest friends have been telling me stories that have been passed down that include walking until they hit the ice wall, and the story of where cranberries come from goes back to a mastodon hunt. So they've been here for a long time. And I think that their story is intertwined with the Penns, and many of the things that we face that are uncomfortable today that we want to see improved, get better, their origins are far back in history. And we need, I think, as good citizens to become aware of that and to become sensitive of that.
My question has to do with one of the last things you talked about, which caused a reaction, which has to do with as I understood what you said, that Penn had a very different approach to Native Americans versus Negroes, as they were called, and that he suggested inviting Native Americans into meeting, but having a separate meeting for, I guess, slaves or freed slaves, I'm not sure. But I was wondering if there was anything in his writing that is a clue to what led to that difference. I mean, on the face of it, he was used to blacks as slaves, and he owned slaves himself, and he was encouraged by the Crown to treat Native Americans fairly. But that seems, and at least in my mind, more on an economical level. I was wondering if in a spiritual way there was any writings or any clues about why he would make such a separation.
If there are, I haven't found them yet. And to share with everyone, the Penn family correspondence, William Penn's correspondence, all stayed together until after the American Civil War. And the last male descendant of the family, and some people, some historians claim that guy was going crazy or something, but he sells all of the family correspondence to 2 rag dealers in London. We believe 50% of the Penn family correspondence was pulped and destroyed. The other rag dealer starts to look at this, and some of this correspondence at that point was 200 years old. So he starts to part it out to collecting institutions. And there may very well have been writings in there, personal writings, where he says, this is why this person rates and not that person. And it's one of the challenges we have at Pennsbury when it relates to the enslaved people that he was dealing with at his home here and perhaps back in England. We just don't know. I do think that, one of the things that I want to point out is that we make a mistake of looking at men and women of color strictly through the lens of enslavement. There were free men here long, for years and years and years. I attended a wonderful presentation at Jamestown on President's Day weekend, and it had to do with a man who was enslaved. He was a Portuguese slaver, and the British Navy captured him. The prize, of course, besides the Portuguese ship, it moves this man to Jamestown. This man, after 5 years, gets his own freedom and becomes one of the first members of legislature in Jamestown in the 1650s. Sadly, he himself is an enslaver. And there is a great story that comes out of New England about a man named Squanto. What most people don't know about Squanto is Squanto was captured by an English expedition that was mapping the coast in 1614, and he's carried off to England as a slave. And native peoples were, the Shawnee as a tribe were enslavers. And one of the reasons why they moved from the south to the north was the local tribes who were being enslaved banded together, confederated to go to war with the Shawnee. And that's when the Shawnee decide to move north. And the Shawnee will be in western Pennsylvania around the time of the French and Indian War. But they were capturing other native tribal members and selling them into slavery. So, Penn was seeing not just men and women of color, but native peoples enslaved as well as free. And I think, John, you've hit on a thing that's tantalizing, but I don't have a great answer for you as far as, I think part may be because there are, again, out of the Jamestown model, you have Pocahontas in England and attending church services. So native peoples were, allowed into those church services, but slaves were not at that point. And I think it may just be a kind of a carryover from how he was culturally raised. That is a theory, a guess on my part.
Yeah, thanks. Melanie, you had a question?
Just a really tiny one. Is it true that Penn would have worshipped at Fallsington at some point?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what I don't know is the date, whether there was a meeting house or whether they were meeting in a friend's house. And up until 1688, friends were not allowed to have their own meeting houses. So on that first visit, were there friends meeting at, somebody's home, and whose home was it? I honestly don't know. But I do know he attended the Falls meeting. Absolutely. And that was during his second visit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that something that Charlie knows the answer to? I'm thinking it must be in minutes, right?
Am I on?
Yeah.
Sally, are you asking about the first visit or the second visit?
Geez, I didn't.
I think any.
Yeah.
Well, I would agree with what you said, Doug. I mean, well, during the first visit, they didn't have a meeting house built. They worshipped in people's homes. By the second visit, they built a meeting house. And when William Penn was there in the summer, he may have worshipped in a preparatory meeting in Pennsbury, or he may have gone to the Falls meeting. There was, when William Penn left in 1701, Falls Meeting wrote a glowing letter of support that he was supposed to take back to England, of all the ways that he'd been important in Falls Meeting.
Could I follow up on that too? So it's my understanding as a member of Fallsington Meeting that we are now in the third version of meeting houses at Fallsington. The second one is where the 1787 building where the nursery school is, and the first one was a wooden meeting house that would be right at the square at the center of town, near where the driveway sort of comes out onto all that pavement. Is that correct? And would William Penn possibly have worshipped there in that building? Is that what we're wondering?
Jonathan, what Sam always said, the first meeting was a smaller wooden meeting, which was approximately across the street from where the present William Penn Center is. The second meeting house, built in 1728, was what is now called the Gambrel Roof House. It's now apartments owned by Historic Fallsington, and it's across the square. The third meeting house is the one that's the William Penn Center, 1798, I think. And then when there was the schism in the 1820s, the existing meeting house continued to be worshipped at by the Hicksite Friends. The Orthodox built their own meeting house in 1741, which is the present meeting house that Fallsington Friends use. So that was the sequence of meeting houses that have been in Fallsington that I'm aware of.
In 1841, Charlie, that's, I think you just.
Did I say 1741?
Yeah, just slip of the tongue.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Friends, I don't know if there are other questions. I'm sure we could talk for hours. And I think we've had a really deepening time, a challenging time thinking about our friend William Penn and his impact on us, his legacy. And it might feel like Penn is a long time ago, living in different culture in different times. And yet his description, as you said, Doug, of having had an experience of violence in his life, of war, having been a seeker and a traveler and meeting different people, and having had a direct experience of the divine revealed to him personally, even at a young age, was what drove his life and brought him ultimately to Quakers. And it's just a privilege to hear you speak about his life and to see how we relate it to our own lives, including the painful things that we still live with today from the legacy of the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. And also the inspiration. You mentioned the Charter of Privileges, which we know is the Charter of Liberties, and still wrestling with freedom of conscience, and in these political times and social times, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom to live how we would choose to live and worship how we want to worship. Still a challenge for us as human beings. So we're, in some ways, we can relate to what Penn must have been, what must have been in his own mind and soul.